Pope Francis is dead at 88 years old, and we've got to talk about what happened, what happens next, and what it all means. Right, but starting with his death, we can say that it's a total shock, right? He's been out of the hospital for about a month after spending 5 weeks there and nearly dying from a case of double pneumonia, with his doctors reportedly telling him to take it easy for at least 2 months and to avoid crowds and situations where he could be exposed to germs. Though with that, I'll say notably, by early April, his health had reportedly begun to improve, and Francis, he was already known for putting the church above his health, and he seemingly wasn't taking it all that easy, at least for an 88-year-old man. Earlier this month, he made an unexpected visit to St. Peter's Basilica. Last week, he greeted hospital and other medical staff to thank them for nursing him back to health. And last Thursday, which was Holy Thursday for Catholics, he met with dozens of inmates at a prison near the Vatican. And then on top of all that, he actually had been gradually increasing his meetings with Vatican officials, and he recently met with a king and queen of the UK. But then us also seeing yesterday him meeting briefly with American Vice President J.D. Vance before appearing to bless the tens of thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square for Easter Mass. Right, and so with all that, just yesterday, you had so many outlets speaking about his continuing or ongoing recovery, which is why, despite knowing how fragile his health was, it was pretty sudden when the Vatican announced that at 7:35 this morning, the Pope had, quote, returned to the house of the Father, with the Vatican later revealing that a stroke and subsequent heart failure was the cause of death. And so then with that, you had mourners beginning gathering back in St. Peter's Square, and you had leaders all around the world offering their condolences, including from the US, of course, with J.D. Vance, for example, who was baptized as a Catholic in 2019, paying tribute to the Pope in a post to X, writing, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill, but I'll always remember him for the below homily he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul." And also with that, you had Trump writing on Truth Social, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis. May God bless him and all who loved him." Though all of that is notably, Francis had openly and repeatedly criticized Trump. As far back as 2016, for example, he questioned then candidate Trump's faith, saying at the time, a person who thinks only about building walls and not of building bridges is not Christian. And then more recently, you had Francis referring to Trump's plan to ramp up deportations as a disgrace, and also claiming that his immigration crackdown was driving a major crisis that damages the dignity of men and women. And then beyond that, while the plight and well-being of migrants was a major focus of Francis, he'd been described by some as the woke pope for his relatively progressive views on other issues including gender, sexuality, conflict, and climate change. Or with his most controversial moves among some Catholics probably being to express support for the LGBTQ community and same-sex civil unions. And that is in addition to things like taking steps to improve the gender balance in the church, right? Increasing the number of women working at the Vatican, including those in leadership positions. And so with that, Francis's tenure, it's widely been seen as having deepened divisions within the Catholic Church in general, and perhaps especially in the United States. And so now, the big question that everyone's asking this time around is whether the person who succeeds him will be someone interested in preserving his legacy and continuing his work, or unraveling it. Understand, even if you are not Catholic, the answer to that question, it's not something to ignore. There are roughly 1.4 billion Catholics around the world and at least 50 million in the US, and the Pope, he has real influence. And so with that, we need to talk about a number of things, starting with what exactly Francis's influence has been. Because while he may be the so-called wokest Pope yet, that's by Pope standards. Or he never went so far as to endorse same-sex marriage or the idea of women being priests, with some feeling like he never went far enough with his calls for reform. And then notably on the issue of rampant child abuse in the church, he got mixed reviews. Right, on one hand, a few years ago, he announced sweeping changes to the way that the church deals with cases of sexual abuse. But more recently, he'd been accused of opposing reforms that would seriously address the problem of clerical sexual abuse of children and vulnerable adults. And that, as some accused him of turning a blind eye to priests who assault nuns and force them to have abortions. And similarly, while he urged all members of the church to never cover up sexual abuse, he himself was accused of having knowledge of allegations against American Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, with in fact a Vatican investigation eventually finding he had been aware of allegations and rumors regarding McCarrick's behavior, but believed that those allegations had been reviewed and rejected by his predecessors. But even with all that, right, his fiercest critics, those were conservatives and traditionalists, or with some claiming he had abandoned traditions, undermined the church's moral teachings, and one archbishop even branding him a heretic and getting excommunicated. And in another case, you had hundreds of priests and Catholic scholars signing an open letter urging him to reverse his decision to approve blessings to be conferred upon people in same-sex relationships, with notably Francis firing back and denouncing what he described as their hypocrisy and saying, "Nobody gets scandalized if I give my blessings to a businessman who perhaps exploits people, and this is a very grave sin, but they get scandalized if I give them to a homosexual." And notably with that, Francis was at times especially at odds with Catholics in the United States. And in 2023, for example, Francis blasted what he saw as the backwardness of some conservatives in the States, with him saying that they had replaced faith with ideology and that a correct understanding of Catholic doctrine allows for change over time. And then, even as he was criticizing Trump, some Catholic leadership in the United States has seemingly sided with MAGA. And so, for example, in 2021, we saw things like some bishops issuing guidance that would deny the sacrament of communion to Catholic politicians who publicly support and advance abortion rights, such as is Joe Biden. And although they mostly backed off after the Vatican warned against using the Eucharist as a political weapon, with Francis preaching that communion is not the reward of saints but the bread of sinners, some still defied him. Right? I mean, you had the Archbishop of San Francisco saying specifically that Nancy Pelosi would not be permitted to receive communion in his archdiocese unless she was willing to publicly repudiate her stance on abortion. And now, as we're in Trump 2.0 land, I mean, we've seen bishops applauding the administration's initiative supporting school choice, rolling back federal support for gender transitions, and requiring foreign agencies receiving U.S. aid to certify that they don't provide or promote abortion. And so that's why, with all this, you have some saying that the Trump administration is not above trying to steer the election for the next pope in its favor. With this, for example, seeing one observer of Vatican politics telling Politico they've already influenced European politics. They'd have no problem influencing the conclave, and adding they might be looking for someone less confrontational. Now, of course, that said, it's not clear exactly how the administration would manage that, but it would be a huge mistake to take the process of selecting a new pope as not political. Right? As you may or may not know, the way that it works is that within the next 15 to 20 days or so, the more than 250 members of what is known as the College of Cardinals, they're going to gather in Rome for what's known as a conclave. Though notably, only those under 80 years of age are actually allowed to vote. Right? And so they enter the Sistine Chapel, they swear an oath of secrecy, and then they vote by secret ballot. And in fact, a 2/3 majority is needed to elect a new pope, and they just vote again and again until this 2/3 majority emerges. So this is maybe you've seen on some screen. After every vote, smoke is released through a chimney that can be seen from St. Peter's Square. And when a vote ends without a 2/3 majority, the smoke is black, and when a decision is reached, the smoke is white. But also, in reality, there is so much more to it. Right? For one, Francis did all that he could to influence the eventual outcome before he died, seemingly trying to pack the College of Cardinals with like-minded candidates. Take Mykola Buchok, for example, an Australian-based Ukrainian bishop who advocated for legislation to help migrants and refugees settle in foreign countries. With him last year, at 44 years old, leapfrogging more experienced and higher-profile Catholic leaders to become the world's youngest cardinal, which, very important here, makes him one of 138 cardinals out of 252 in total eligible to vote for the next pope. And this is notably 110 of them, they've been appointed by Francis, which is about 80%. But even with that being the case, you have experts saying it is far from certain that you're going to get another Francis. With us seeing, for example, Austin Ivory, who's written a biography on the now-deceased pope, saying, to say he has stacked the College of Cardinals is not quite right. And adding, the idea that these cardinals will necessarily think like Francis is complete nonsense. It's trite. They're highly intelligent people who think for themselves. And it's also not just that, right? The Vatican is also no stranger to lobbying and backroom dealing. So for example, while those older cardinals, they can't vote, far fewer of them were appointed by Francis, and they can play a key role in behind closed door discussions that take place ahead of time. And in fact, ahead of the 2013 conclave, Francis himself reportedly benefited from the influence of a group of cardinals who were too old to participate in the proceedings, but still were able to influence the outcome. And a key thing is, at least according to some, those cardinals, they are not afraid to play dirty. With us seeing, for example, a former senior Vatican official telling the Sunday Times, most cardinals have some kind of a sin, whether it's money, a boyfriend, or a love child. Everyone knows which cardinals have works of art that they can't afford or who visits the gay saunas. And then adding, if for whatever reason someone needs to be removed from contention, then that information is deployed by a rival faction. And so with that, according to the College of Cardinals report, which is a project run by an independent team of Catholic journalists and researchers, there are at least 22 real contenders here. And on major issues, including those dividing liberals and conservatives, like ordaining female deacons, blessing same-sex couples, and openness to divorce and remarriage, they're all over the place. So for example, you have the likes of Cardinals Matteo Zuppi and Luis Antonio Tagle. And so Zuppi, he was among Francis's closest allies, and so he'd likely keep things headed in the same direction. And then Antonio Tagle, he could be similar as well, right? He's criticized the church's attitude and language towards gay people, unwed mothers, and divorced or remarried Catholics. Also, being from the Philippines, he'd actually end up being the first Asian pope in modern history. And I specify modern history because, as some have pointed out, the first pope, St. Peter, as well as some other popes, they've come from the Middle East, which can also be considered Western Asia. But in any case, right, it would be pretty notable to have one from this century, especially since Catholicism is on the rise in many parts of Asia as well as Africa, unlike in the United States and Europe. And actually, with that, another name that's been floated is Cardinal Peter Turkson. Right, and Turkson, he's from Ghana. He'd be the first confirmed Black African pope, and he's kind of been the Vatican's lead man on climate change, as well as spoken out against anti-LGBTQ legislation in his home country. He's also in the past been accused of anti-Muslim sentiment, having once shown a video sharing false statistics to claim that France would become an Islamic republic within 39 years. So also, in addition to Turkson, there's another contender to be the first Black African pope, and that's Robert Serra from Guinea, though I will say his views are very different. Where he's branded so-called gender ideology as demonic and talks similarly about what he's described as Islamic fanaticism. Also, speaking of possible leading candidates on the conservative side, you have Cardinal Peter Erdu from Hungary. Right, he is notably close to Hungarian autocrat Viktor Orban, which makes it unsurprising that he's been vocal on immigration, reportedly having once compared the act of taking in refugees to human trafficking. But in any case, finally, you also have someone like Cardinal Pietro Parolin Paolino, who's now the Vatican Secretary of State. And Paolino, he's seen as more of a moderate figure who could potentially appeal to both liberals and conservatives, with one unnamed Vatican insider reportedly telling the Telegraph he's very experienced, and that could count for a lot in these times of turbulence. He could be seen as a steady hand at the tiller. But even then, there's more names to consider, with different outlets publishing their own lists of top contenders that are all different and include several names I didn't mention here. But for now, we're gonna have to wait to see what happens, and there's a lot that could play out from now to when they pop that white smoke.